2:47 a.m. Tehran time. While the rest of the world slept, two separate messages were moving through two completely different channels. One was public, loud, typed in capital letters on a social media platform by the most powerful man on earth. The other was quiet, encrypted, moving through diplomatic back channels that most journalists do not even know exist. Those two messages said opposite things, and Reuters found out. Now, here is what you need to understand about that. Reuters is not an anti-war publication. Reuters is not an activist outlet with an agenda. Reuters is the wire service that central banks trust, that hedge funds subscribe to, that institutional investors use to move billions of dollars before the rest of the world wakes up. When Reuters confirms a story like this one, it is not an editorial opinion. It is a signal that something has shifted at a level that can no longer be contained. Today, we are going to decode exactly what that signal means, what it reveals about the actual state of this conflict, what it reveals about who holds leverage, and what it suggests is coming next. Because the ceasefire nobody wanted you to know about just became the story nobody can ignore. Here is exactly what we are going to cover today. And I want you to stay with me through all four layers, because each one builds on the last. First, what actually happened behind the Reuters headline, not the version that was managed for public consumption, the raw sequence of events. Second, why a rejected ceasefire is strategically more valuable than an accepted one. This is the part that mainstream analysts are completely missing. Third, the financial architecture running underneath this conflict that is creating pressure on Washington in ways that no press briefing will ever acknowledge. Fourth, three specific scenarios for the next 30 days, with a probability assessment for each one. If you are watching this channel for the first time, subscribe right now, not as a courtesy, because everything in this conflict is moving faster than the news cycle can track. And the next development will not wait for you to find us again. Let us begin. Let us start with the illusion. Because before you can understand what is actually happening, you need to see the assumption that collapsed. For 4 decades, Washington has operated on a doctrine so deeply embedded, it stopped being examined. The formula is simple. Economic strangulation plus military superiority equals submission. Isolate the target, sanction the economy into dysfunction, deploy overwhelming force, wait for the government to collapse or capitulate. It worked in 1991. It worked in Libya. It produced results in dozens of smaller theaters across 3 decades of American foreign policy dominance. So when this conflict began, the planners in Washington did not question the formula. They applied it again. With confidence, with the full weight of the most expensive military apparatus ever assembled in human history behind it. And they announced a 2-week timeline. That was the first signal that something was fundamentally wrong, not with the execution, with the thinking. Here is what the doctrine was never designed to account for. An adversary that spent 20 years not merely surviving sanctions, but architecting its entire economic and military infrastructure around the assumption that sanctions would never end. Iran did not adapt to pressure. Iran internalized pressure as a permanent operating condition and built systems that function within it. That is not resilience. That is something structurally different. That is a nation that removed the leverage point entirely. When you sanction a country that has already removed your leverage, you are not applying pressure. You are performing pressure. For a domestic audience that does not know the difference. Now, layer on top of that the intelligence failure. And I want to be precise about what kind of failure this actually was, because it was not a failure of information. There was information available. Analysts had data. Satellite imagery existed. Signal intelligence was flowing. The failure was cognitive, specifically what intelligence professionals call confirmation bias within the assessment cycle. The analytical framework was constructed around a predetermined conclusion that Iranian air defenses had been sufficiently degraded, that the rescue operation was viable, that large transport aircraft conducting a recovery mission would not be engaged. Every data point that contradicted those conclusions was filtered, weighted down. contextually reframed to fit the model. The model was wrong, and 22 human beings potentially paid for that model with their lives. But here is the deepest layer of this illusion, the one that no official press briefing will ever address directly. The weapons themselves were designed for the wrong war. An F-35 is the product of 30 years of concentrated aerospace engineering. It was designed to achieve air dominance against a peer competitor operating within the same industrial tradition. It was designed to impress, to dominate, to justify its $100 million price tag in congressional testimony. A Shahed drone costs $20,000. It was designed to be produced in volume, to saturate, to make the mathematics of interception economically catastrophic for the defender. When you bring a weapon designed for congressional approval into a conflict against a weapon designed for mathematical attrition, you are not fighting a war. You are validating a procurement strategy against an adversary that does not care about your procurement strategy at all. The board changed. The playbook did not. That is not a tactical problem. That is a civilizational mismatch. And the consequences of that mismatch are now appearing in Reuters headlines that Washington cannot walk back. Now we go deeper, because the battlefield losses, as catastrophic as they are symptoms. What I want to show you today are the mechanisms underneath. The structural choke points that are doing damage no missile can repair. Iran is not winning this conflict through superior firepower. Iran is winning it through superior mathematics. And once you see the equations, you cannot unsee them. Choke point number one, the production bottleneck that Washington cannot talk about publicly. The United States produces 57 Tomahawk cruise missiles per year, 57, from a single manufacturing facility located in Tucson, Arizona. One factory, one production line, one geographic vulnerability. Each significant strike package in this conflict consumes dozens of those missiles. The math is not complicated. The rate of consumption has structurally outpaced the rate of replenishment before this conflict entered its second month. And here is the critical detail that the $100 billion emergency funding request cannot solve. You cannot appropriate your way out of a manufacturing capacity problem in the time frame this conflict is operating on. Money does not instantly create factory floor space. It does not instantly train the specialized workforce required for precision munitions assembly. It does not compress the 18 to 24-month lead time that currently separates a congressional authorization from an actual missile sitting in an actual weapons bay. This is not a logistics gap. This is a structural equation without a solution in the current operational window. And Iran's strategic planners understand this equation with precision. The saturation doctrine, flooding defensive systems with volume, was not designed to win individual engagements. It was designed to accelerate the consumption of American precision munitions at a rate that the industrial base cannot sustain. Every Shahed that forces an interceptor response is not just a tactical probe. It is a deliberate withdrawal from an account that replenishes at 57 units per year. That is choke point number one. The arsenal is finite. The consumption rate is not. Choke point number two, the financial architecture that nobody is modeling correctly. The surface number is $100 billion in emergency funding. That is the figure being discussed publicly. That is not the actual cost. The actual cost requires a different accounting framework. Begin with direct hardware replacement, drones, munitions, base infrastructure. Then add the actuarial cost of casualty compensation, long-term medical care, and the legal architecture surrounding personnel whose status remains officially Then calculate the opportunity cost of redirecting domestic production capacity away from previously scheduled defense commitments to allied nations who are now quietly recalibrating their security assumptions. Then look at what the bond market is doing. United States Treasury yield spreads have been behaving in ways that quantitative analysts at major institutional funds are watching with considerable attention. Credit default swap pricing on sovereign debt instruments has been adjusting in ways that reflect a market probability assessment of extended conflict duration that is significantly higher than official government projections. When the quantitative trading algorithms at the largest fixed income desks on the planet begin recalculating their baseline assumptions about American fiscal trajectory. That is not a political opinion. That is capital moving in response to mathematical modeling of unsustainable expenditure patterns. Smart money was repositioning before Reuters published a single word. The publication simply confirmed what the derivatives market had already begun to price in. That is choke point number 2. The financial cost is not $100 billion, it is $100 billion, plus the compounding sovereign credibility discount that every additional week of unresolved conflict applies to American fiscal instruments in global capital markets. Choke point number 3, the information architecture. And this is the one that may ultimately prove most consequential. For weeks, a specific information containment strategy was operational. Western audiences received a managed version of events. Casualty figures were minimized. Hardware losses were contextualized. The narrative framework held. Then Reuters published. Then Sky News confirmed. I want you to understand the precise significance of that sequence. Iranian state media reporting this story is expected. Regional outlets covering it is anticipated. It is fully discountable as adversarial information operations. But Reuters is the wire service that the Financial Times subscribes to, that the Associated Press cross-references, that every major newsroom on the planet uses as a baseline verification source. When Reuters independently confirms a narrative that originated from Iranian military sources, the containment strategy does not weaken. It collapses entirely in a single news cycle. And here's the dimension of this that almost nobody is discussing. Iran did not need to conduct an information operation to make this happen. They did not need to hack systems, fabricate documents, or plant stories. They simply needed to conduct military operations that produced physical evidence, wreckage, imagery, confirmed hardware losses, that was sufficiently undeniable that a wire service operating under the strictest verification standards in financial journalism felt professionally compelled to report it. That is not propaganda. That is a strategy of creating facts on the ground so visually and materially concrete that the global information architecture eventually has no choice but to process them accurately. The information choke point works like this. Every Reuters confirmation makes the next containment attempt more expensive. Every Sky News report raises the credibility cost of the official counter-narrative. Every subsequent attempt to minimize or reframe the losses now has to overcome not just the original evidence, but the institutional credibility of the outlets that have already confirmed it. Washington is no longer fighting Iran in the information space. Washington is now fighting Reuters, and that is a conflict with a predetermined outcome. 3 choke points: production, finance, information. None of them are on a battlefield. All of them are determining the outcome of this conflict more decisively than any single military engagement. The mathematics does not care about the messaging, and the messaging can no longer outrun the mathematics. Now, let me show you something that the conflict coverage is almost entirely missing. The people who move markets for a living have a different relationship with uncertainty than journalists do. They do not wait for confirmation. They do not wait for official statements. They read signals. They model probabilities. And then they move capital before the headline exists. In the weeks preceding the Reuters publication, something specific was happening in the energy futures market. Brent crude positioning by institutional players was shifting in ways inconsistent with the official narrative of a short, decisive conflict trending toward resolution. The options market for oil volatility was pricing in an extended disruption timeline that contradicted every public statement coming out of Washington. Sophisticated investors were not listening to the press briefings. They were reading the physical evidence and reaching their own conclusions weeks ahead of the news cycle. That is not insider trading. That is what competent geopolitical risk modeling looks like when it is operating without the constraint of needing to protect a political narrative. Graham Allison at Harvard spent years documenting what he called the Thucydides trap. The dangerous moment when a rising power threatens an established one and miscalculation becomes structurally likely. But there is a variation of that dynamic that receives far less academic attention. What happens when the established power begins escalating rhetorically while de-escalating operationally? When the public language becomes more aggressive precisely because the private options are becoming more limited? History has a consistent answer to that question. Adversaries read the operational reality, not the rhetoric, and they calibrate their response accordingly. Iran has 40 years of experience reading the difference between what Washington says publicly and what Washington does operationally. That institutional knowledge is not theoretical. It is embedded in every strategic decision their military planners are currently making. Sun Tzu identified the highest form of strategic achievement 2,500 years ago: to subdue the enemy without fighting. Iran has not subdued the United States, but they are executing the next closest available option with considerable precision. They are making the cost of continuation so mathematically, financially, and informationally unsustainable that the internal pressure within Washington to find an exit becomes greater than the external pressure Iran needs to apply directly. The elite consensus is not being spoken publicly, but it is being priced into markets. It is being reflected in bond spreads. It is visible in the repositioning of institutional capital. The smart money has already reached its conclusion. The question is how long before the official narrative catches up with what the derivatives market already knows. Let me be precise about what I am about to give you. These are not predictions. They are probability-weighted scenarios constructed from the structural forces we have just mapped. The choke points, the financial mathematics, the information architecture collapse. Each scenario follows logically from those forces. What differs is the variable that tips the balance. Scenario 1, the managed retreat. Probability assessment, approximately 45%. This is the highest probability outcome precisely because it requires the least acknowledgement of failure. The mechanism works as follows. Washington identifies a formulation, a specific arrangement of language by Zayn Sabine the DC's Arivrangshainskain series shed allows a cessation of hostilities to be publicly described as a strategic pause rather than a capitulation. The framing matters enormously here. It is not what happens on the ground that determines domestic political survival. It is what the event can be made to mean within the information environment that Washington still partially controls. The mainstream media apparatus cooperates, not through conspiracy, through the structural incentive of access journalism. Outlets that challenge the official framing lose their briefing room seats. The story gets repackaged. The casualties remain officially minimized. The hardware losses get absorbed into a broader narrative about mission evolution rather than mission failure. But here is what the managed retreat does not resolve. The actual costs do not disappear. They get transferred into future defense budget line items, into classified supplemental appropriations that Congress approves without full public accounting, into the sovereign credibility discount that allied nations begin applying to American security guarantees in every other theater on the planet. The wound gets bandaged. The underlying condition remains untreated. And in Taipei, in Tallinn, in every capital that bases its security calculations on American deterrence credibility, quiet recalibrations begin that will take years to become visible and decades to reverse. Scenario 2, the escalation spiral. Probability assessment, approximately 30%. This scenario initiates from a single trigger event. One loss that is too large, too visible, and too documented to be managed through the normal minimization architecture. A loss that breaks through every containment attempt simultaneously. When that happens, the domestic political pressure to respond overwhelmingly becomes irresistible. B-2 bombers. Strategic assets. The full conventional escalation ladder deployed in a single accelerated sequence. And here is where the scenario becomes genuinely dangerous in ways that extend far beyond the immediate conflict. The Strait of Hormuz carries approximately 20% of global oil supply through a geographic choke point that is, under this scenario, now inside an active high-intensity conflict zone. The algorithmic trading systems managing global energy futures do not wait for human analysis. They reprice instantly. The cascading effect on inflation, on central bank policy, on the sovereign debt mathematics of every import-dependent economy on the planet begins within hours of the first escalatory strike. This is not a scenario anyone in any capital is openly planning for, which is precisely the historical condition under which it becomes most likely. Scenario 3, the frozen conflict. Probability assessment, approximately 25%. No formal ceasefire, no dramatic escalation. The conflict transitions into a sustained low-intensity attrition engagement that neither side officially acknowledges as permanent. This is Iran's most comfortable operating environment. They have maintained exactly this kind of frozen engagement across multiple theaters for 4 decades. The cost structure heavily favors the side with lower daily operational expenses, simpler supply chains, and a domestic population that has already normalized conflict as a permanent condition. For Washington, the frozen conflict is the most politically survivable option in the short term and the most strategically corrosive option in the long term. Every week of frozen conflict continues drawing down the precision munitions inventory, continues applying the sovereign credibility discount, continues feeding the information environment that Reuters and Sky News have now opened. The conflict does not end. It simply becomes invisible to the American news cycle. And invisibility in this context does not mean resolution. It means the structural deterioration continues without the political pressure that visibility would create to actually address it. Iran has 40 years of experience with invisible conflicts. Washington has a 4-year electoral cycle. The mathematics of patience are not complicated. There is a principle that operates beneath every negotiation, every conflict, every strategic confrontation in human history. It does not care about military budgets. It does not respond to social media posts. It cannot be reframed by press briefings. The person who needs the deal less always wins, not the person with the larger army, not the person with the more expensive weapon system, not the person with the loudest voice on the largest platform. The person who can afford to walk away every time without exception. In the last 48 hours, one side requested a ceasefire. One side refused. That single asymmetry tells you more about the actual state of this conflict than every official statement combined. You do not need to read the classified intelligence assessments. You do not need access to the back-channel diplomatic communications. You simply need to identify who made the request and who said no. That answer is now documented in Western sources that cannot be dismissed as adversarial propaganda. Now, here is the deeper principle. The one that extends beyond this specific conflict into something that defines this entire historical moment. The 20th century was won by the side that could produce more tanks, more aircraft, more industrial output. Volume defeated quality repeatedly across 2 world wars, and one Cold War. The 21st century is being won by the side that can make the other side's production economically irrational, not by outproducing, by making production itself the vulnerability. When your weapons cost $100 million and mine costs $20,000, I do not need to defeat your weapons. I need to make you run out of the budget to replace them faster than I run out of the will to continue. That equation is now visible to anyone paying attention. So I want to leave you with one question, and I want you to answer it in the comments below. Looking at the 3 scenarios we mapped today, the managed retreat, the escalation spiral, the frozen conflict, which one do you believe we are actually heading toward? And more importantly, which one does the financial market evidence suggest is already being priced in? Subscribe now. Because whichever scenario unfolds, we will be here mapping every move before the mainstream narrative catches up. The next development will not announce itself, but we will see it coming.
O koko